Skill in speaking depends on many factors, but one of the most important is understanding the rules that govern speech. These rules, which help define what is considered normal behavior in a given society, are called norms. It's important to remember that norms can vary a lot from one society to another. However, there are some rules that tend to be more universal across different cultures. Unlike laws, which have clear penalties for breaking them, these interactional norms don't usually come with formal punishments. Instead, society influences our speech by teaching us these norms, which we learn through socialization. Understanding these foundations of speech norms helps us see how social context shapes our communication and why it's so important to be aware of the norms in different settings. Let's take a closer look at how norms influence the amount of speech people produce. As you can see, these norms can vary widely, from very little speech to quite a lot. To illustrate this, I want to share a fascinating case study from a tribal community in southern India called the Pulia. In this society, very little speech is actually the cultural norm. It was observed that by the time a man reaches around 40 years old, he has practically stopped speaking altogether. This isn't just about individual personality. It reflects broader cultural expectations. What's interesting is that this lack of verbal interaction is connected to the society's overall social structure. The Pulia society isn't particularly cooperative or competitive, which influences how children are socialized. Instead of being encouraged to depend on or work with others, children are socialized to focus on their own concerns. They stay in reasonable proximity to others, but there's no emphasis on constant communication or interdependence. This case really highlights how cultural norms shape not only communication styles, but also social organization as a whole. So the key takeaway here is that norms governing speech quantity are deeply embedded in cultural context and social structure, influencing behavior from childhood through adulthood. Some norms, such as the principle of informativeness, are actually recognized by all societies, even though we might see cross-cultural examples that seem to challenge that idea. For instance, in Madagascar, the norm of informativeness is generally valued, but it only applies when it doesn't conflict with other important principles. One such principle is the idea of keeping news to oneself, especially if sharing information could cause social harm. Another key point is that social norms are often guided by deeper motivations, like the concept of face work. This helps explain why social interactions tend to run smoothly most of the time, even when misunderstandings or difficulties could arise. So, while informativeness is a universal idea, cultural contexts can shape how and when it's prioritized. Sometimes, other principles, like protecting individuals from harm, take precedence, which highlights the flexibility and complexity of social norms across cultures. In addition to just knowing the norms of speech, society also gives us a set of concepts for thinking and talking about different types of talk. These specialized terms actually make it much easier to socialize children because they provide clear labels for different kinds of conversation. For example, primary school children quickly learn explicit rules for a lesson, such as the need to raise their hand and wait for permission before speaking. On the other hand, they understand that a chat has very different rules. It's more relaxed, and interruptions or diversions are usually okay and can even make the conversation more lively. They also learn that a discussion has a specific purpose and outcome in mind. This understanding helps guide how they participate, knowing that their role is to contribute towards a goal. All of these concepts, these labels and rules, are part of what we call metalinguistic understanding, and they play a crucial role in how children are socialized into different kinds of speech situations. It's fascinating because it shows how language isn't just about words, but also about understanding the social functions behind them, which ultimately helps us navigate our social worlds more effectively. It is a mistake to assume that societies are homogeneous in how they control speech. In reality, there's a lot of variation in norms, and this variation is just as common as differences in language itself. People use their adherence to or rejection of specific speech norms to figure out where they stand in relation to different social groups. For example, in one group, the norm might be to swear, shout, and argue openly as a way of showing belonging or creating a certain persona. In another group, people might barely speak at all, using silence as a signal that they identify with that community's values. Ultimately, individuals have a lot of agency in managing their own speech. They can choose to obey these social constraints or deliberately flout them, depending on their personal goals or who they want to connect with. This highlights that locating one's identity through speech norms is a dynamic process. People are actively shaping and reshaping how they communicate to navigate their social worlds. It ties back to the overall theme that language isn't just a means of communication, but also a powerful tool for defining and expressing who we are.